Hi, Greta. Can you hear me? Greta, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Good. I'm always glad to see that I got it set up right. That's the
Hi.
big
I know, that is like the most stressful thing. No matter how many times you use it, you're like, "Oh, I hope it works this time."
Well, especially now I don't start these on campus anymore. That day we did on campus and the internet kept going out, remember? It was like, oh, great.
Oh, yeah.
Campus would be a better place, but I do it from home now just to make sure. So we'll see how many people come today. I think middle of the summer and not too many days reminder. I don't know. We'll see. I was
Yeah.
worried about that too. Every party I give, I always worry nobody's gonna
It's not a reflection on you, Teresa, directly.
come. Okay. So how's everything going? How was the conference last week?
It was good. It was large. Cleveland was nice, surprisingly nice.
That's what I
Um, um, and I don't know. I mean, it's the same. I don't know if it was any better than any other year.
heard.
Every time it's a little bit different. So yeah, it was good. They had a whole um, track on military, so they had a lot of emphasis on that. So that's nice.
Good. I heard they had a Me Too discussion.
Yes, they did.
It sounds like that was probably pretty cool.
Yeah, that was different.
Uh-huh.
It's good.
That's about all I heard.
Yeah, they brought an author in to talk about something, but honestly, I was bored by him.
Oh, yeah.
They were trying to do something different at lunch than just people presenting, having more, I guess something more outside of the scope of problem gambling. But I don't know. I kind of had, it was lunch and you kind of burnt, and it was the last day, and I went to do something, and I ended up coming back, but I could not engage with him. I think it's particularly hard when you don't know the author or read his book. So
Right.
that was a little unusual. I could not quite figure out why he was invited um,
Right.
over someone else, and yeah, I just couldn't quite figure that out. I don't know if he was just somebody that Keith White was familiar with, because he kind of had a whole dialogue. It was just a dialogue with Keith and him,
Oh,
and it was just, yeah, it was different. But I mean, I'm glad they try different things. It's just I don't know if that really worked.
all of a sudden somebody will come in and they've usually paid them a lot of money too. That's the other part I'm always like, seriously? Because they usually $3,000 come to talk for an hour and they don't talk about the topic or they talk about something you already know.
Hmm.
Really risky. But
Yeah.
then I always think about, well, I don't know how often they notice it, but I always think about what if you were the one presenting and then you're totally off topic. So, here's somebody. Somebody just entered. Who is that? Let's see right there. Oops. Ah, no. So Marie, okay, we have a few. Hi, Zaida. Do we have a few people? Can everybody, I don't know how to tell if you can hear me. Can you say if you can hear me? Hello? Can everybody hear?
Hi, this is Mary Lane. I can hear you.
Oh, good. Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you this morning?
Good.
Thank you.
Oh, I see it looks like some people have it. Oh, no, wait, just another second and then we'll start. Oh, we lost me. Then we got him back again. Check what time it is. timepiece here. 1 second. Okay, so it looks like it's 10:01. Let's wait another couple minutes. Okay, well, it's almost 5 after, so I'm going to go ahead and rolling. Hopefully everybody's somewhere comfortable and cool. I'm going to mute everybody to get started, and then I'll unmute as we move along, just to keep up with the background noise like we have in the past. So here we go. Okay, and so you can unmute yourselves anytime you want to say something. So if you're having trouble doing that, I'll still open it up every once in a while for those who maybe aren't sure of how to unmute themselves. But otherwise, at any point, if you want to chime in, and please do, just go ahead and unmute yourself and say who you are and ask a question, offer a comment, whatever that you need to do. So today we're talking about one of the really basic things about family therapy that really distinguishes family therapy from other forms of counseling. And it has to do with this idea about levels of change and how we think about the processes involved in therapy. So I'm titling this first, second, and third order change. And today we'll be applying this kind of thinking to problem gambling treatment. This is our 7th forum. We have only one more after this in the fall. And then we have the advanced calls, I believe we're still doing. So we're almost at the end of a 2-year series of forums. So let's keep going. Let's see if I can keep going here. There we go. All right, so mostly, like I said, this particular session is going to focus on this levels of thinking and levels of change in relationship to problem gambling treatment. So I'm going to emphasize the importance of taking a meta view. And I'll explain what a meta view is, and recognizing the self of the therapist, the self of the counselor as part of the therapeutic system. These are things that a lot of people might be familiar with if you've been trained in family therapy, like I know, some of you have. this is going to be pretty familiar, but I'm hoping we can work together to see how this fits and what difference it makes in problem gambling treatment. Because I think it actually makes a huge difference, particularly when you're working with families. So the learning goals today are that we're able to recognize our own role in the therapeutic process. In other words, we're able to step back and see, what difference does it make when we're able to see our own positionality and our own actions and reactions as part of what's going on in the therapeutic process. Let's see if I need to do something different here so that I'm not doing that. Let's just do that. We also want to be able to identify the differences between first, second, and third order thinking and first, second, third order change. And then, of course, there needs to be an application piece. So the so what factor, how might we apply these concepts to treatment with families struggling with problem gambling? So I'm going to just see if I can open this up here and see if does anybody want to make a comment or have a thought about this, or should I just move on? Okay, moving on. By the time we're all done with these, I may learn how to deal with the system. Okay. Oops. So I'll start with first order change. So there's an important place for first order change, but it tends to be the kind of change that you'd expect. Like it tends to be direct and common sense. So when you look at what families are already attempting and what individuals are already attempting, a lot of it is first order change, attempts at first order change. Things that make so much sense, you just can't believe they don't work. Like I give examples here of setting a limit, or, when you win, just walk away. Just don't gamble. The best thing for you is just to not gamble. The best thing for me is just to not gamble. Or sometimes partners will say, well, just gamble when I'm with you, and that way I can stop you when it gets too advanced or whatever. So we do this all the time, and common sense solutions are just that. I mean, we have to make common sense solutions every second of every day in order to function. We have to decide things like, should I slow down if I'm about to hit somebody? That's, it's only common sense that yes, you should slow down. So a majority of our thinking really daily is at that level of just, having what's called common sense. One of the problems with common sense, there's a number of them when it comes to trying to address problems that are more complex, like problem gambling or couple conflict or whatever. So if you think about problem gambling, family members will use, as we all do, many common sense solutions. So they'll attempt to do things to make things better that just makes sense to them. For example, you might, check somebody's wallet. You might think, well, if I could just stop them from gambling, so I'll just go to the casino every time they go to the casino. Or the problem is my child has lost all of their money and now they're super stressed out. So the best solution I have right now is just to pay the rent. So a lot of these common sense solutions have been labeled as purposeful in some way, as codependent. And so you think about, like, a lot of the things that we do in relationship to an out of control behavior in a family member are really just attempts to solve the problem, but at the wrong level. So solving it in a way that actually creates more problems. So I think I've talked about this before, and some of you family therapists know this, but there was a group in the Palo Alto, the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, Václavic, Wickland, and Fish, who talk about problems as attempted solutions. And they talk about that in three ways. One is when people overreact to a problem. Another one is when they underreact to a problem. The one we're talking about here is when they apply common sense solutions to a problem. So the trouble with common sense solutions is that they make so much sense, you just don't stop. So like if you're talking to a client and you're offering a common sense or first order change solution, you might be saying something like, well, you need to set limits. And then, you go to supervision and you say, man, I've been talking to this client for 12 weeks about setting limits and I just can't get them to set limits. So you've tried what makes so much sense, And you try it over and over and over. And because it makes so much sense, it's hard to give up. And in reality, what might be happening, certainly we talk to people for a long time about things like this, but what might be happening is that you're not seeing a more complex pattern that would help somebody move toward that solution. But at the moment, they're not prepared for that solution or ready for that. So one way to think about this is that this first order change of solutions meaning change um, is change within a set of alternatives. So if I see the world this way, if I see my child as rebellious, then everything they do that, like, say, let's say I see my teenager as rebellious, and they don't get up out of bed in the morning, and they're not grooming themselves, and they're surly and cross. I might say, that's all about rebellion. So when I see it that way, my alternatives around rebellion are things like discipline. Um, uh, what else do you do when kids rebel? Maybe giving them more space, whatever it is. You're thinking, okay, I need to solve this within a framework of a rebellious teenager. It limits other sets of alternatives, like the description I just gave is also of a teenager who we might call depressed. And so then if you think of the person as depressed, all of a sudden, wow, there's a whole nother set of alternatives. Oh, maybe I need to, help my child get support from a therapist. Maybe I need to help them, with some other problem that they're having, or to exercise more, or medication, or whatever. So the idea is that when your ideas are limited, when your thoughts, we always are limited. We always have a frame around what we're thinking, and we try to find solutions within that frame. So a lot of counseling is done that way, where the counselor, the therapist has a frame of reference, a way they believe something to be true, and then all the solutions are attempted within that single frame. And we know families do that. They always, I shouldn't say always, but most of the time come in with a set of ideas about what's wrong. So they'll come in with an idea of what the solution should be, and then they'll deliver that attempted solution to the therapist or the counselor, and hope or expect them to then get family to follow through with what they know is right. So I'm going to keep going here, and I'm going to come back to that idea because it's kind of a big idea and a little. So a lot of the common sense solutions tend to be dominant sense solutions or dominant cultural sense solutions. So if you look at a lot of things, like you've got a 24-year-old who is living at home. And the first thing we think is, oh, there's something wrong there. The 24-year-old should be out on their own. Well, that is a dominant cultural norm or value that prioritizes autonomy, independence, this sort of individualistic views. And it's a very Western, very Euro-centered idea. So even when we're using common sense, we're still using it. We're using it from a frame that often borrows what the dominant or majority group thinks is natural or makes sense or should happen. So that becomes another really important piece of this, because you end up making huge assumptions based on sort of what's commonly understood as true or right or best. I was going to go back there for a minute. Let me just go back and see what I was trying to remember here. Okay, so I just wanted maybe to talk just a bit more about this idea of families coming in. So I know those who have worked with me know this, but people have already tried a bunch of solutions. So they've already got an idea of what the problem is, how to frame it, how to understand it, and they typically come into therapy when their solution isn't working. And they've given a reason for that solution not working to themselves or others. So it's something like, I don't know. You might think, well, what we really need to do is we need to learn. A lot of couples will say this: we need to learn to communicate. The assumption is that we don't communicate well, and that's the problem. And so they will come into a session and say, our problem is that we don't communicate well. Now, if a counselor or therapist is taught to do couples work based on communication, if they believe the same thing, that the problem is you don't know how to talk to each other, then the couple is going to expect the therapist to give lessons or to interrupt or to do things to help them talk to each other differently. Now, they also have an idea of how to talk to each other differently. So one partner will say something like, well, she or he never listens to me. I want you to get them to listen to me. So they've got a frame of where the problem is. They have a sense of what needs to happen. And they oftentimes ask the therapist to execute that. Now, that dovetails in quite well with what organizations often expect us to do. Agencies will expect us to sort of meet clients where they are and ask clients what their goals are and put those goals in the treatment plan in their own words. So let's just take that example. You've got a couple, they're coming in, they're saying, at least one of them who's drugged the other one in is saying something like, we just don't communicate well. They never listen to me. And if we just listen to each other and share our feelings, I know we could be better. And the other one's saying, well, I don't know if that's it or not, but I'm willing to, to try it out or whatever. And the therapist is like, great, this is a great couple. They know that communication is their problem. And I agree with that couples just need to communicate differently. So then you've got this treatment plan that says they need to communicate differently. Well, now you've just totally solidified the idea about the problem, which is oftentimes a common sense or popular psychology sense of what the problem is, and you've made that the priority. There's been no chance to shift the way in which people are thinking. So what we know from research, for example, with communication is people can communicate beautifully. They can say, when this happened, I felt this, and I wish you would that, and they can do all that sort of communication effort 101 or whatever, and they can still show each other contempt. They can still withhold. They can still be dishonest. They can still not share power and responsibility. So actually, there's a whole lot of other ways to think about why a couple's not getting along that then get pushed away in favor of this one set of alternatives. The one set of alternatives being we're not communicating well. So that's what we're talking about is how else can you view a problem other than the way it's currently being viewed by society, by the people who are coming in, by your natural or common sense, and even pop psychology and so on. So I'm going to open it here because I know that's a lot. I want to see if everybody's with me. Anybody have any thoughts or comments about that? Any crazies? Anybody? You with me?
Hi, Teresa. This is Diane.
Hi, Diane.
How are you? We don't have the screens or the slides pulled up yet, so.
Okay.
But I was just going to say, I've found in couples work sort of what you're talking about with the, that tends to be the thing that people always come in with is the communication. We don't communicate well. And I found that, teaching those communication skills as a first order change kind of helps to de-escalate in order to go into all that other stuff that you're talking about.
Right.
Sort of as like a prelude to empowering them and feeling like that something is moving.
Right.
As a way that sets it up for the second order change stuff.
That's a really great point, Diane. And you're looking at, then you're thinking, and we're going to get to this in a minute too, so keep this in mind what Diane's talking about. You're thinking second order while you're working first order. You're getting that communication to happen. You are changing the process of the way people talk to each other or helping them do that. But the goal is to get at whatever is really going on or happening in there. So that's a great example. Anybody else have anything you want to add, or should I move on? Okay, I'm going to mute everybody and move on. Yeah. I think I did it. Okay. So, we already said this. Psychoeducation is not the same as common sense solutions, and I want to be careful about that because in problem gambling treatment, we offer more psychoeducation, at least as family therapists, by far than is sort of typical. We don't typically launch into stuff about, we might a little bit, but we don't go into as much stuff about how, with gambling, you're talking about, how chance works or how random events work. You're talking about, dopamine in the brain. You're talking about all these different things and adding these into people's understandings throughout the therapy process, as well as hopefully in some groups. Now, when you're doing that with a family, we've already talked about this, then the whole family can begin to shift their understanding of what the problem is. So psychoeducation can actually help influence a shift in thinking and a broadening of alternatives. So it's really different to say, well, that's interesting because, it happens a lot with people where they just, start chasing that win or chasing that loss. And then people say, oh, this is not unique to me. This is a pattern other people get involved in. And it's not an ending place in itself, but it begins to break up the schema or the idea or the set of alternatives that people come in with, which is, I should be able to control this. I just want to be able to stop, or I want to be able to gamble, quote, normally, that kind of thing. So I just want to differentiate those a little bit. So it's super important to use first order change in problem gambling treatment or any kind of family treatment. So you don't want to avoid first order change. In fact, any major second order change will be followed by first order change. And sometimes first order change can turn into second order change. So for example, you might ask a couple to spend more time, take a walk together every day. And that's a pretty first order change because they can take that walk and they can do everything exactly like they've been doing during the walk. On the other hand, that might be an opportunity for them to begin to spend some time differently with each other or get at more of a meta process that you're interested in shifting. And if that begins to happen as they're walking, then that helps you move into that second order change. Or if you're working on them having some time as a couple away from the family to support the couple relationship, then you might ask them to do something very common sense, like take a walk together. Because at that point you're saying, I want to solidify this connection between the couple, and I want it to be without anybody else, parents, children, worries, whatever. And so by asking them to take a walk, I'm actually trying to shift the hierarchy, shift the structure of the system. So they can go hand in hand like that. And first order thinking and change is super important in crisis and early recovery. So money barriers to me are the absolute ideal example of first order change, because you're saying basically we need to stop the bleeding, we need to stop the money. That's so common sense. Of course you need to do that. What becomes less common sense is how, and becomes more process oriented and more likely to affect second order change are things like, gosh, who should it be that does sets up the money barriers? At what point is a person prepared, is in the right stage of change to actually take action on money barriers? Should the money holder be the person who has more power in the relationship or less power in the relationship? And what relational patterns are likely to ensue based on how we negotiate the money barriers? But those things are things, budgeting is another one. I mean, you would really never budget, hardly ever budget with a family, because it's sort of like at the wrong level of change. It's real direct, it's real common sense. You're standing or sitting or whatever, and you're spending a half an hour talking about the water bill and all this stuff. But it makes sense in problem gambling because money is so salient in the way people think about money. So the whole time you're working the budget, you're also thinking about broadening sets of alternatives and second order thinking, because you're addressing how each person thinks about money, breaking up the fantasy world about money as being, and looking at real world problems. So you're pulling people into addressing real world problems instead of living in the fantasy. So there's a whole bunch of things that are going on there with that budgeting that are occurring at a different level other than the actual budgeting. But you can have two therapists go in. One goes in and both of them are going into a budgeting session. One will go in and think the budget and believe the budget is the main goal. And it is a goal, but they'll stay with just the budget, not paying attention to who's contributing, who's talking, how the couple or family has agreed, what their own role has been in facilitating this process. And they may come out with a budget and it may be fine. Another therapist might go in and say, okay, the content of the session is about budgeting, And we're going to end up with a budget at the end, hopefully. But I'm going to pay attention to the process of what's going on between people, how they're talking, how they're thinking, who seems to have more influence here, what happens if I side with one and not the other, all those kinds of things. So it's very interesting as a supervisor watching the way in which people will take on the same task, but in very different ways that lead to very different opportunities for change. So I gave here an example of a change in relationships and repetitive patterns after a second order change. So for example, let's say you've got somebody, you know, we always want people, or hopefully, to disclose debt to the people that are partly responsible for that debt or their family members. So then that leads to budgeting. Budgeting and disclosing debt and budgeting may lead to working as a team. Now, working as a team or working as a team to fight the gambling, that's second order change. Now you're not fighting each other. You're not seeing one person as a problem. You're seeing gambling as a problem and you're coming together to work against it. That is a pretty second order systems change. Now you're sharing bank account information, but you're doing it as a team. So that's the kind of idea I'm talking here about, the way in which first and second order change constantly weave in and out of with each other. Just going to make sure we're all on board here. I'm going to ask if anybody wants. Oops. Hold on. Oh. Sorry, hold on. Okay, anybody have anything they want to add or talk about that?
Nope, this is Mary Lane. I'm good.
Hi, good. Okay, I'm going to go on then. So this is what I'm getting at. I've been getting at here. A focus on first order change as primary, as the main thing, tends to limit the therapeutic process. And we tend to see people who are new in therapy really diving into this first order change. I'm going to show you a quick YouTube video of a therapist who has gotten totally embedded in first order change. And I think there might be an ad, so I'm not sure if this is the one, but I might have to take a second to, nope, here we go.
I smell beer. Did you go to Moe's?
Oh, every time I have beer on my breath, you assume I've been drinking. Oh, that's a long one.
Did you at least get the medicine?
I tried, and I failed miserably. But I'm willing to work this out in counseling.
We've been to every counselor from Avery to Zabinski.
But not Silhouettes. And that's why there'll never be another golfer as good as Chichi Rodriguez. The name and the game. He had it all.
Okay, I think we got a little off track here.
I know this marriage isn't perfect, or even great, but now I treasure the moments where it's just so-so. I kill for okay. Please, please, just tell me what to do.
I've never said this, and I don't even know if I'm supposed to say this, but this marriage is rotting with the stench of death.
Oh, that seems a little strong.
How about reeking like a trash can in a dog park?
Does my marriage have to be something you can smell?
You see, Marge? You see? The only way you and Homer will ever be happy is to spend a little time apart, followed by more time apart, followed by a divorce.
What?
Wait, what's going on? Wait, no. I remember. Happy anniversary.
Homer, listen to me. There's just so much I can take.
No, we can save this. We'll go to a therapist.
We're at a therapist.
How you doing?
Okay, so in that video, oops, darn it. Hold on. In that video, you could see how the therapist just completely didn't pay attention to the process between Marge and Homer, and she just came up with a common sense solution. And if part of the problem there is that the longer you wait and the more inducted you get into their way of viewing the problem, the more likely it is that you'll get stuck where the family's stuck. So in this case, she got stuck right where they're stuck. She says, there's no hope. You're just going to have to get a divorce. And she gave that sort of common sense solution. I'm going to open it up here to see if anybody has any thoughts about that or comments.
this Mary Lane still here.
Okay. Okay, good.
Enjoyed the Simpsons.
I'll just bring it up a little bit.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going on then. Hold on. Muting everybody. There we go. Okay, so so most clients are thinking first order, and therapists may at times be talking first order while thinking second order. And that's kind of, in some ways, it's a little different from what you said, Diane, but it's similar in that you're saying, well, actually, this change that the couple needs to make in how they talk is a kind of important change so that they can then talk about what they need to talk about, which is a little bit different. But I like that example because you have a purpose for that sort of initial kind of advice or that initial kind of help that you're offering. So in this, let me see how I do this now. Darn it. I don't know if I can do that. I'm trying to get at another video I have. Sorry. Okay, I'll just have to end it. So I have a video of Rick talking to oops, that's not it, sorry. Rick talking to a new client. And in this conversation, he's inviting this client into a session, and this is the client's first session. And so he wants to make sure that this man actually gets to the therapy or to the counseling appointment. So he goes into some very common sense ideas, but they're super important because as he's getting, these are things that he wants to handle or help in order to even get the person to engage. So I think this is a great example of how to use some of those things that are very obvious sort of and direct and common sense in order to help the therapy process along. I hope. Why is it doing that? Okay. Hold on, I'm gonna have to reload it. It's weird. I tested this all out ahead of time. If I can remember where it was. Is that 19?
And one obstacle might be that you're driving past that bar where you sometimes gamble. And I'm wondering if there's a way to do something about that potential obstacle.
Yeah, I'll take the freeway.
Mm-hmm. And how safe is that given the whole overpass thing?
Oh, right. No, you don't have to worry about that.
How about you? Are you worried about it?
Not right now.
Okay. Okay, so is the number that you gave me a cell phone?
Yeah.
Okay, so right now it's about noon. And would it be okay if I gave you a call a little bit later today to just see how you're doing before the appointment to see if any obstacles pop up that might prevent you from coming here?
Okay. Sure.
Okay, so we can do that. So we've talked about how to get here, and we've talked about some of the obstacles. Do you have any questions about the counseling process or anything else? I think I mentioned before that all treatment is free.
Okay, let's go back to where we were. Okay, so that example is really short, but you can hear how, Rick knows a lot about how people enter treatment for problem gambling, and he knows a lot about problem gambling. So he's using what we call accurate empathy. He's saying, I can pretty much guess that this person's calling at noon, they're going to come in at 4, that there might be something might get in the way of this person coming in. He even knows where they are and how they're going to get to the clinic because he's given directions. And he knows that one of the favorite places to gamble is on the way. He also, before this, said, 4 o'clock. And the guy said, yes, I was going to watch the game, but, and Rick said, oh, well, if you want to watch the game, which of course he would bet on, if you're thinking of watching the game, should we make it a different time? Do you want to come in and, so he's looking for those things that would cause this person to go from that first phone call to sort of blowing off coming in. So that's really direct sort of common sense information or first order change information. But on the other hand, he understands the pattern, which the client does not understand at this point, but Rick understands the pattern. So he's thinking second order. He's thinking, okay, here's the pattern of what happens with people when they start to come into treatment. They call, they get that initial sort of maybe a little bit of relief, a plan to come in, and then they maybe go and start gambling and put that off or talk themselves out of coming in or whatever. So he's working, thinking of a pattern at the same time he's talking very directly in first order change. Okay, so in order to think beyond that sort of level, and this is really, I would think, the hallmark of family therapy. If you had to say one hallmark of the approach, is to take a meta perspective. And what we're talking about here is being able to do things like, you hear phrases like, oh, it's thinking about how you think, or thinking about thinking. Or when you meta communicate, it's talking about talking. So you're it's sort of like at a different level. So you're thinking, but you're also thinking, right now, am I thinking within which frame of mind or which frame of understanding or worldview am I thinking in? And what difference does that make in what I'm doing in therapy if I'm thinking from this framework or that framework? And if you're talking about talking, you're saying, you might say to somebody, it seems like every time we try to talk about this, I get really anxious and you get really upset. So if those of you who've been in relationships with, somebody meaningful to you, you can almost always, relationships, you can identify those relationships where you're able to talk about how you talk and those relationships where you weren't. So we know that when families come in and they can talk about talking, they can meta communicate, they can step back and say, well, this is what I've noticed going on between us. They're much more likely to be able to solve problems and so on. So as therapists, we have to be able to not only meta communicate, but take that meta perspective in order to be able to meta communicate. It's also called in family therapy taking a multi-ocular view, which means basically that you're looking through multiple lenses at the same time, or maybe a single lens that you're looking at things from this direction, you're going zooming out, you're zooming in. So you're always trying to get multiple sides of this phenomena that's happening and view it from every single family member's perspective, from the societal perspective, from the perspective of maybe a theoretical model, perspective of what you know about gambling. And you're looking at, and it creates new dimensions. It creates new ways of thinking and doing when you're able to challenge yourself to step back and look at the multiple facets of a problem. It also means taking a meta perspective that when you step out or step above or away from what you're involved with right there with an individual or family, you're also able to observe yourself in relationship to others. So in supervision, for example, we often will say to family therapists or problem gambling counselors, what did you notice going on between you and the clients? Or what happened just there when the daughter said this, the mother said this, and then you kind of let the mother rule the whole session. You kind of, she talked a lot. And so it's the ability to step back and observe those dynamics that you're actually in. And you can't really do that without a meta perspective. Now, one of the ways we get meta perspective, at least in when we're reviewing sessions and so on, is through videotape. So videotape actually physically allows you to videotape get a sequence of interaction on tape, put it up on a screen, and then step back and watch it. And when you're able to do that, all of a sudden you see all kinds of different things that you couldn't see when you were in it. So over time, what you're trying to do is to get more and more familiar and more building the habit of stepping outside and looking back as if you're watching a videotape of yourself. I'm going to just open that up and see if anybody has anything they want to add or say. Everybody good?
I'm good.
All right, here we go. Okay, so now we're getting to second order change. So again, facilitating second order change requires you to be able to look at the bigger picture and to identify repetitive patterns and schemas. So every living human being looks at patterns. You couldn't make it down the street to the grocery store if you weren't looking at patterns of traffic, and you have predictable patterns. You need to look to see what's going to happen next. I mean, how would you gather a family to dinner if you didn't have sort of predictable repetitive patterns? You say, hey, everybody, it's time for dinner. Then everybody sort of meanders around and comes to the table. And if they don't do that, some don't get mad at them or whatever it is. But you've got sort of these predictable patterns, repetitive, and these sort of ways of looking at the world. So for schemas, you have to decide on some things. You have to be able to say, to look at the world through some lens. And that requires this sort of putting pieces together or creating patterns. So when you're looking at second order change, you're paying close attention to all of those patterns and what's going on between people, how people are thinking, how the pieces are put together relative to the family as well as the schemas. And in second order change, you're focusing on what we call changes in sets of alternatives. So where before first order change, you have a single set of alternatives. I look at gambling as an issue where people are not able to be in control of their urges, say. And so everything I do, if I'm a family member, everything I do is under that set of assumptions or that set of alternatives. I'm going to help you control your urges. I'm going to do that by trying to, I'm thinking it's because you don't care enough about me or that you're not trying hard enough. So I'm going to just, keep talking about how you should be trying and what you're doing to the family and so on and so forth in order to get change to happen. Now, that alternative, that set changes. There's another alternative when you go to treatment or set of alternatives and you find out, oh, wait a minute, this is an addiction. This is something where the gambling has a hold of my partner or my family member or my father, whoever. And it's now, he's sort of at the mercy of this thing. Oh, wow, that's really different. Now I have a whole nother set of alternatives to work from. And the therapist is more likely to be able then to create change in family structure, change in patterns, change in things that are more lasting. I'll show you that here. So second order change is typically said to have occurred when system rules and shared meaning change along with interaction. So if you look at a family as they first come in, and then you look at the family, say 6 months into recovery, they have a whole different set of meanings and their interactions are very different. And their rules about who does what and how they interact are very different. So that would be considered second order change. If they're still doing the same things they did when they came in, but not gambling, that would probably be first order change. But typically in recovery, we see people, really understanding things differently. And they're able to go back to somebody who's just starting out in treatment and say, oh yeah, I thought that way too, but now I understand this. And, we work together in this way. And so they have made these significant shifts in how they view the problem and what they do. So most problem gambling treatment, the real treatment objectives are focused on second order change, becoming aware of gambling patterns. So, the therapist needs or the counselor needs to be understanding the gambling pattern. You've got your basic understanding or knowledge of problem gambling, which then informs your ability to identify a more tailored pattern in a family around gambling and with an individual around gambling And you're able to identify triggers to interrupt gambling, those kinds of things, but you're also helping the family become aware of those. So it's very common, right, that in treatment, you're helping individuals and couples and families look at, oh, this is the pattern that goes on between us, and this is the pattern of thinking, feeling, and doing around gambling. And oh my goodness, look, we could interrupt, here's a trigger, and we could interrupt that by doing something different. Now that ability for them to see that pattern, they're really they're getting a meta perspective. Instead of being stuck in the problem and just going for the next step, they're looking at, oh, this is a big circle. Even when you're doing linear analysis, or what do they call that? Can't think of the word, but when you're trying to just understand what's happening next, it still helps for people to have that perspective of a pattern of behaviors. In family therapy, we tend to look in more circular patterns. It doesn't mean they're in a circle shape, but we always go back to the beginning so that we can see how the problem gets repeated over and over. You're also looking at second order change, that we're talking about restructuring family relationships. We've already talked a little bit about that today. Changing gambling schemas and worldview, and things like overcoming experiential avoidance. So if you were to just be, let me see if I have this in the next slide. No, I don't think so. I'm going to go back here. The last time in the advanced call, we talked a lot about dealing with emotion. And so experiential avoidance, of course, is got to do with that, is how you, when you have an internal experience, gambling is one way to avoid, and that's a real typical thing to have when you're gambling problematically. So if you're thinking about second order change, you're not just helping people identify and share their emotion. That might be part of it, but you have a broader understanding of how that's a piece of experiential avoidance, and how people will need to be able to deal with emotion. And you also have a better idea of how that can happen over time if you're thinking this more meta perspective. Like we think we know, at our clinic we use cognitive behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral family therapy early in treatment, and then we move in more into ACT later in the treatment. So at the beginning, to ask somebody to do one of the typical tasks for ACT is to allow, to be mindful of what you're thinking, and to know what you're thinking and feeling, but you just sort of allow that to happen, and you live with that discomfort, or you experience that discomfort. Now, if you do that at the beginning, that's exactly what gambling's already doing. And so if you were to ask people to experience all that emotion and discomfort, they would probably just blow out of treatment, because that's the point. They're trying to avoid that. So you might start earlier on with cognitive interventions that ask people to think about how they're thinking and to change how they're thinking. So in other words, they become meta thinkers. They think about, oh, right now I'm thinking that I'm going to win because I'm wearing my black shirt. And that's one of those thinking errors. So after a while, then you can get into the experiential avoidance, but the process of therapy even has to do with how you think about the creation and maintenance of second order change. So here I want to show you how another clip of The Simpsons, and one of this whole topic, we chose this topic because last year when we asked for topics, I don't think the person who asked about it is here today, but they asked about some of the participants wanted to think about this therapist as part of the system, or what we call second order cybernetics. So I'm going to show you a clip of a therapist who has no idea of second order cybernetics and gets completely caught in the system. For most of us, we get caught in the system, but it's not this obvious. So again, the term second order cybernetics refers to this ability to see the therapist as participating in the pattern and making meaning with clients and families. Early on in family therapy, we looked at systems as self-regulating and as existing separately and sort of closed in a way that sort of the old mobile idea that they used to express a lot, or the thermostat idea that a system would self-regulate, and that the therapist's job was to go in and perturb it and get it to change. And then pretty quickly on, by the 80s at least, people started saying, no, the therapist is also part of the therapeutic system. It's not that they're objective, sitting outside and then, able to make these interventions into this system. The therapist is also part of the system. So the good news part about that is that when you enter a therapy meeting or whatever session, and you actually do become part of the system, and therefore that's part of how you can affect it. At the same time, the bad news part is you can get caught right in it, and you can become just stuck in the family pattern very, very quickly. And so and then we'll talk, time's going fast. Well, let me show you this video here. This one I do think has a...
Family therapy? What the hell is this? You said we were going out for frosty chocolate milkshakes.
Well, I lied. Simpsons? Welcome. So what brings you to family therapy? Well, Doc, it's like this. They're all driving me crazy. I don't know what to do.
No, my show is an orphan.
Lisa!
Oh boy, mints.
Go ahead, take one. We never laugh anymore, Doc.
You can say that again. When Homer's right, he's right. For once, the old man's correct to ruin it.
Shut up! I'm sensing some deep-seated hostility here. Why don't we all take a deep cleansing breath? Don't you think you've had enough mints, son?
I ain't leaving till that bowl's empty.
Put those mints back, boy.
Ew!
Lord, you little slob! You ruined the whole bowl!
Don't talk to my brother like that, you big oaf!
Oh, why, you little borderline psychotic! Oh, it talks to my daughter like that? Oh, yeah? Now you're gonna bully me like you bully your kids?
We don't like you, sir.
Leave this office, please.
Okay, so in that sample, in that example, there is a high level of what we call parallel process going on, or this mimetic isomorphism. So here the family is, where the family is, Bart typically is sort of abusive to the kids, and he's really demanding, and Marge is always sort of off to the side and doesn't really deal with things very much, and but is always kind and sort of loving. And then Bart's always the kid that's getting into trouble, and you can see how Homer, the only disciplined was Lisa, who tends to be the good child or whatever. And the therapist takes over the parenting role right away. The therapist says, "Would you like a mint?" So he makes a pretty big mistake and enters the parent role himself right off the bat. So he's the one that offers the child the candy instead of asking the parent, if you child would like a mint, it's up to you. If you'd like to offer him one, go ahead. So he enters in as the father, as another parent, as a father. And so then as Bart does what he does, and he's eating all the candy, the therapist then says, "Stop it! You're eating too much candy," right? And so, and when he does that, then Bart eventually throws up the candy, and then the therapist does exactly what Homer would do. He gets mad, he's yelling, he's being abusive to the kids, just exactly like as Homer would be. So at that point, the therapist and the family are caught in the same exact pattern that happens outside the therapy. Marge waits. She doesn't say anything until it gets way out of hand. Her kids do something totally socially inappropriate. They cut off the tie. They kick the therapist. And at that point, she says, "Oh," so she's giving her like, "Oh no, this is terrible," kind of frame, but she doesn't really intervene in anything. So it's the exact picture pattern that the Simpsons are in over and over and over again that the therapist gets caught in. He tries a very common sense technique. He says, well, let's take, and if you watch The Simpsons in therapy, which I have watched a few of them, the therapist almost always says, let's take a deep cleansing breath. And it's, that's the joke on the idea that therapists have sometimes really common sense solutions. Now, there's nothing wrong. Actually, we do want to help individuals and families with engaging in mindfulness, centering kinds of experiences, but in this case, it's completely overshadowed by the pattern that he's caught in. Now, if this therapist, let's say, I can't remember his name now, but the doctor were to go to talk to a supervisor, it's highly likely that the supervisor and the doctor would also get into the same issue. The supervisor might say, how could you do that? You did the wrong thing, blah, 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 blah. And in that point, he would sort of become another hierarchical member, and he would be, again, like taking over the therapist role instead of helping the therapist make up his mind. So you see these patterns where, and they tend to be worsened when therapists get stuck in common sense and they get stuck in content. They're more likely to just get right where the family's stuck, and then they get stuck together with the family, and then sometimes it'll go on to supervision. So I'm going to see here if anybody, I'm going to unmute everybody. Does anybody want to add or challenge or ask a question or anything?
No. It's Mary Lane, good here.
Okay. Go again. It's the strangest phenomena to talk to a screen, not see all these people, all of you that I know, and I want to see you. Okay, so then I'm just going to talk for a minute about third order change. This is a fairly new idea. It was introduced in different ways, a little bit in organizational change and a little bit in family therapy, but this is really a concept that my colleagues and I have been developing. This idea about what's the next order of change? What's the next order of thinking? And so I just want to mention it because we've been working on it for several years, and it's, of course, I think it's interesting, or I wouldn't be working on it. But third order thinking requires thinking of systems. So before you've got a set of alternatives, which is first order, then you've got sets of alternatives, more than one set of alternatives, which is second order. And now we're thinking there's sets of alternatives. So you're looking at, oh my goodness, look at the way in which how we think is impacted by so many multiple systems. So we've got full systems of systems. So what's the relationship, for example, between capitalism, patriarchy, and racism and race? And how does the relationships in the most intimate family relationship reflect the relationship between these broad societal economic systems? And then how is gambling situated amidst those societal systems? Now that's really heady and it's really abstract, I know. So I want to bring just some ideas that make it a little more practical. So you're thinking about the social location and interconnections of identities between you and the therapist and the clients and all of that, and how these broader societal systems affect treatment and affect the way in which people relate to each other. And you're also thinking about expanding alternatives and possibilities for change. One more slide, and I hope this is going to become a little more clear. So let's talk about some examples of third order thinking and third order change in problem gambling treatment specifically. So when we're thinking about the meaning of money, if we're thinking about the meaning of money as just something that's intergenerational, it's something that maybe, I don't know, has to do with just thought schemas for individuals, that's very different than if we think about the meaning of money in societal context. You know, so then you start thinking about, oh, well, money, for example, I'm not saying this is all the way it is, but money oftentimes signifies success, and it can be a way to influence and get respect and all kinds of things that money is an indicator of. So having money, then there's this sense that I'll be elevated in society, that I'll be worth more. Class and classism in a society that is a capitalist society. Class and classism is supported by the idea that you can make it if you try hard enough. And so the people who have made it then must have tried hard enough, must be more successful, must be sort of better than the people who don't have money. So you have this whole set of ideas around money that is supported by democracy and supported by capitalism. And so if you don't see money within that context, you're going to miss some things. There's a whole context of gendered relationship, which we talk about a lot, and I know I've already talked a lot about, but if you think about patriarchy and you think about, again, democracy, you think about, you know, some of these bigger systems of male privilege and so on. And then you look at what goes on between couples when there's problem gambling. You often see power dynamics. Sometimes gambling can be a way of sort of escaping a power dynamic and so on. So you just keep looking at these. Another good example that I give a lot is you see the relationship between fathers, sons, and patriarchy and capitalism. So if you believe that if somebody is competent and works hard, they should be able to be successful. And so you might have a family where you've got a very successful father who's the patriarch of the family, and an adult son who doesn't seem to sort of measure up as far as being as successful as his father. And their families they're trying to help the son be successful, but they don't stop necessarily to think about what's the societal message around sons and fathers, and family messages around whether it's okay for sons to do something different, if it's okay for sons to not produce what their fathers have produced, for them to be as successful as their fathers, and also the amount of sort of expectation, for example, for 20-something men that are white and able-bodied and upper class. The expectation is you are going to be successful financially, and if you're not, there's something really wrong with you. So that contributes sometimes to problem gambling. I'm not saying it's the cause of it, but those things are contributors that we need to think about problem gambling. And also then when we're using things like ACT, are we really thinking of the social construction of values? A person doesn't hold individual values. There's really no way to hold an individual value. You hold a value from your milieu, from what Bordeaux talked about as habitus. It's from the way in which you grew up. It's the places where you and your people are. It's the shared value. So I gave an example a little while ago about the value of independence. And a lot of times we don't even expect those values. They're just so embedded in the culture, in the dominant culture, that we just assume that that should be a high value. So in problem gambling treatment, we also need to be thinking about how values are constructed, and so that people can really have some liberation from those systems and those values and those ideas, and have more options for change. Otherwise, this whole societal piece limits the kind of change people can engage in. I'm going to open that up because I know that's kind of complex. Any thoughts or questions about that? Okay, so we have almost about 20 minutes. So I want to just now focus on a really sort of practical piece around doing family therapy, given all the stuff we've been talking about. We've been talking about patterns. We've been talking about being able to step back and take a meta perspective. We've been talking about change at various levels and thinking at various levels. And now I just want to talk a little bit about process versus content. So this is a very familiar concept for anybody that's trained in family therapy. In fact, after about 3 or 4 months of practicing, almost everybody I know needs to focus more on process versus content. And most of the time when therapists get stuck, like I was saying earlier, it's because they're getting caught in content. So this is a little bit repeating what I've just said, but I'm hoping that's okay. So a focus on content tends to lead the therapist to common sense or non-solutions. It tends to be limited to first order change. It tends to, when therapists get stuck and they come out of a session and they're talking about, I don't know what to do, I don't know why I can't figure out where I should go. We typically say that's being stuck. And the first place we look is, did you get caught in the content? Did you get caught in what people are talking about rather than the way in which they're talking? A lot of times with families with multiple problems, being stuck in the content, it feels like you're jumping from one fire to another. You're trying to, first it's this problem, then it's that problem. And then that's worsened by not planning very much. So we always tell students, that family therapy students, that one of the worst things you can say when therapy starts each session is, how did your week go? because then you start getting into all, I mean, you could, 40 minutes later, you're still hearing about every problem that's happened during that week. Also feeling lost in a sessions or abandoning theory. So these are some of the things that can leave you more less process focused and more content focused, or some of the indicators that that's what's happening. Let me see if I have time here. I want to show you another clip of a family session. This is a family I think most of you have seen before, but it's a different part of the. There we go again. Okay. 1 second. Got it queued up here. So watch in this session how the therapist, there's a lot of content pieces she could be pulled into, and she tends to stay out of specific content. She also will work with the content enough while keeping the process in mind so that the sort of first order kinds of tasks can be done, but she's always thinking second order. So she's asking people, or they're sharing information that's very content focused, very first order focused, like sharing the amount of debt. But the therapist, as you watch, you can hear her mind thinking about, how am I going to get this couple to talk to each other about debt? How am I going to keep them in some kind of alliance with each other during a disclosure that could blow them apart? And how can I keep them both engaged in the therapy process? So those are all meta thoughts that I know she's having while she's doing this therapy.
Well, I know I probably shouldn't go as often as I do, and
Well, how often are you going?
Usually a few times a week, and I've often thought that I should probably cut back. But then, for example, with this credit card bill that Joe found, I was pretty sure I could win that back and get that paid off. Between my job and what?
$5,000.
Sure. And I've won on a number of occasions. And I have every intention of paying that off out of my own earnings and not burden you with that.
Well, honey, I am burdened with it. I mean, it's, it's.
That was never my intention.
$5,000 that we had, intentions for. It's not like we're, really plush right now. So, I don't know. I mean,
it's a pretty big blow for you.
And yeah.
For you both financially.
Well, it's yeah.
Sure. So, Barbara, you said that you usually go maybe a couple times a week, and the thought has crossed your mind that you'd like to be able to cut back, but so how much do you typically spend when you go? Oh, could be anywhere from $50 to a few $100s. And like I said, sometimes I win. But of course, the temptation then is to keep playing. So.
Sure.
So you're saying you lose
Like you could lose a few $100 in an afternoon.
Well, that isn't. I wouldn't say that's the average. It's usually under 100.
Okay. How long do you typically gamble? It's between 50 and a couple hundred, and how long do you typically gamble when you do go?
How long the time?
Yeah.
It depends. If it's while I'm waiting for Sophie to finish one activity or another, it's usually an hour or two.
Sure.
If I stop on the way home from work, it might only be 30 minutes.
So wait a minute, you're stopping on the way home from work sometimes too?
Sometimes you go to the gym.
Yeah.
I might stop for happy hour with someone from work, and Joe doesn't get home until pretty late. And sometimes he's not home for dinner, so I could just sit at home by myself and worry. But I can't stand it.
What? You mean about Jeffrey or about?
I'm worried about Jeffrey? Sure.
Okay, so in that clip, the reason I wanted to show that clip, there's a ton of stuff in there. Like, there's so many times where you're thinking, wow, she's sort of blaming him. She said, well, you're at work, or sort of justifying the problem. And it would be really tempting for the therapist to jump in right there, but she doesn't. Or times where you're thinking, oh, his reaction, we're not even giving him time to speak, while we're trying to get her to talk about how often she gambles. So what's the therapist's motivation? What is she thinking, and why is it important to do the therapy the way she's doing it? Now, I'm not saying that's the only way it could have gone. Another therapist working with the couple might have done it very differently. But I do think it shows kind of how she's thinking. She's like, okay, I've just got to keep this disclosure going. I have to keep him engaged enough. I have to keep her, sort of softly asking her to disclose and to be truthful with her husband, because that's a super important part of the process, is this sort of disclosure, so that both people know what's going on. That increases the urgency for treatment. It increases the urgency for change. There's bigger stakes at play. At the same time, the husband at one point attempts to draw her into siding with him. He looks at the therapist and says, $5,000. That's a lot of money. And the therapist says, sure it is, and empathizes with him, but doesn't go there right then. So what's really clear to me in this clip is this is a therapist who's thinking about 4 or 5 things at the same time, is really focused on the relationship, and is careful about when to intervene, and is not getting caught in the content of what they're talking about, but is really thinking about the process and helping the process move forward so that she doesn't get stuck and the family doesn't get stuck. And she's got an idea in mind of what she wants to do. And she's been able to prioritize that while still going at pacing with the clients, being thoughtful, being connecting, and helping them basically want to come back to the session. So I just think it's an interesting session to see, and as an example of the number of decisions a therapist is making, and while they may be talking at first or second order change levels, they may also be thinking at first, second, or third order change. I know this therapist quite well, and I know she was thinking about power and gender that whole time. She was thinking about third order stuff, but she wasn't talking about third order stuff right then. She was going to pace that and think about it and figure out, how do I, and even as she's talking to both of them, being careful not to side with the husband as the good one who doesn't gamble, but also as the more powerful one. So she's thinking about gender and power and all that at the same time as she's doing the rest of what she's doing. So it doesn't look that active, but in fact, it's quite active what she's doing and what she's thinking. So these were some of the things I'd listed on our handout. I don't know if you all got a chance to read it, but I started thinking about, what are the things that tell us as therapists or counselors that we're sort of stuck in the content and that we're not paying attention to process. And so I'll just run through these really quickly in case you didn't have a chance to read them. And these are just basically from being a therapist for lots of years and doing lots of supervision. But one of the big things for us, or for me, noticing when therapists get stuck or they get caught in content is, am I using a model of treatment? Can I articulate why I'm doing what I'm doing? Do I know where I'm going? Do I know where the session is going? Do I have a plan that can be flexibly applied? Like you saw the therapist do just then. She has a plan. She knows what she wants to get done. She's very flexible and fluid with where she's going, but she is going to get a certain thing done during that session. She's going to get that disclosure to happen in a way that the couple's still connected to each other and to the therapy. Do I use like common problem gambling treatment interventions without placing them in a theoretical framework? For example, I don't know any of us that have taken problem gambling training that haven't heard how important it is to use the whiteboard. But the whiteboard isn't magic. It's connected to a theory of around cognitive distortions and about making what's covert overt. There's some theoretical pieces that then need to be fit into why am I using that particular technique to draw out and focus on thought processes at this particular moment in therapy. So when you're jumping from just sort of technique to technique, it's really common that occurs, particularly when the therapy is symptom focused. So like if you say, well, whenever I work with somebody who's been abused as a child, I have them do an inner child exercise or have them journal. That's a technique that might work very well, but there's no theoretical framework. Another one that we see all the time is, does the therapist avoid interrupting or redirecting? So especially with newer counselors and therapists, and in a time where collaboration is really prioritized at this time in our social thought and history, you see therapists sometimes becoming really inactive. They're not interrupting or redirecting. And I know for me, if I go too long without stopping and thinking and interrupting, I'll just get like mesmerized into what people are saying. It's like, I always think about that. It's probably too old of a reference now, but the movie of Robin Hood, when the snake would get in front of a person and just kind of twist and have those big rolly eyes and everything, I'll get like mesmerized or stuck. And pretty soon I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't think. I don't know where I am, but I've been listening to the content too much. And I'm not stopping and pulling myself out and thinking about where things are going or interrupting or shifting. So if you allow somebody to talk like I'm doing for 45 minutes or an hour, but if you allow somebody just to keep talking about what's going on, sometimes you just get so lost and inducted into that story, you can't do anything else. This is another big one for me. It's one of my probably soapboxes, and that's that everything I ask sends a message. Everything question you ask. Now, you heard Elsa in that last tape asking very practical questions. How much do you gamble? Those questions don't tend to have the same kind of loaded meaning as maybe a question like, well, tell me, was there anybody else in your family who gambled? Now that seems innocuous, but it's basically telling the person who's gambling that this is connected somehow to intergenerational dynamics. And it may or may not be, I don't know, but it's just the importance of being able to recognize that everything I ask sends people a message about what I think. Other ones are feeling stuck. We've already talked about that. Sometimes I've noticed supervisees will rely on a limited number of interventions. So we talked about this last time, but for those of you who weren't at the advanced call or can even use that to recall, I'll watch a whole session or read a whole transcript where all that's happening is that the counselor is asking about the situation, asking about how someone's feeling, and showing empathy. And so then you think, well, why? What's going on there? What's the rationale for that intervention? Or do I just think that's what creates change? If I think my job is to draw out emotion and empathize with it, and that people, when they feel understood, will change, then I would say that's my model of change. But if it's what typically happens is that people believe that at some level, but they aren't really conscious of that, and it really limits the number of interventions a person can do. So I always think of this one: would I be uncomfortable if someone were watching a video? Probably all of us would say yes, but I think you know what I mean here. There's just a few others. Do I rely on common sense solutions? And this is a big one for us at the clinic. Is we're not sending people home with tasks or working on continuing change between sessions the way we should be. So typically in family therapy, I shouldn't say always, but it's very, very common that you ask people to do things to keep the change going between the times you meet. And then you follow up with that. The next time you meet, you find out how something went. It gives you more information and gives them more opportunities outside of session to create change. So let's see. Okay, we only have a couple more slides. That's good because I'm running out of time. So I just wanted to end by talking about then how do we facilitate change? If we're thinking about first, second, third order change, we're thinking about process, we're thinking about our role in the therapeutic process, we're realizing that we can't just sit and listen, that we have to be active. What does that mean in facilitating change? And so these are also pretty common in family therapy training. So this might be repeat or will be repeat for some people. But basically, what I remind myself of is that, no, I don't know everybody's life. I don't know I can't predict exactly what's going to happen. But I better be an expert in therapeutic process by this time. I better know how to address problems, how to get change to happen. And if I don't, I don't think people should be coming and talking to me. So we do need to be experts in the therapeutic process. We also, in this particular treatment, are experts in problem gambling and problem gambling recovery. So I think I've talked about this before, but the huge steep learning curve for me as a family therapist was trying to understand the dynamics of problem gambling and the wisdom in some of the common treatments for problem gambling and the process of recovery and stages of change. And there was just a huge amount of knowledge to gain about this particular problem. So I can be an expert in therapeutic process, but without the deep understanding or growing understanding of problem gambling and recovery, I really couldn't, make that process work. And then the third thing when you're facilitating change is having a guide for treatment. Do you have a map? Do you have a life preserver? When you're stuck, you need to go back to the model that you're using. The next one is really about, we talked about this a little bit earlier today, but determining goals and treatment plan, yes, it needs to be collaborative, but it needs to be informed by the therapist's knowledge. So we don't just immediately take whatever the client's saying. We have a conversation, and in that conversation, we sort of inspect and take apart some of the assumptions, and the therapist has an understanding of and knowledge that they can use to help shape a goal that's really reachable, a goal that makes sense at a second order level, and that the treatment plan can be written in a way that really helps promote change. And then, of course, interventions should be purposely designed to fit particular clients, particularly families, to be used within a model and to be used for this particular problem of gambling. So that's what I have today. I'm going to open it up now for a discussion, and hopefully we'll have a few comments. We have about 5 minutes. Anybody?
Teresa, this is Mary Lane, and I don't have any comments other than I really appreciate these series, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
And always appreciate the humor involved.
Good. Anybody else? Any specific thoughts about today's topic? Or
Teresa, it's Zaida.
hi, Zaida.
I was just thinking about, I really found the list helpful when like checking myself for making sure that I don't get too involved in content. So I know I've definitely done some of those things.
It's super familiar, right?
Yeah, so it's nice to have that for reference and to kind of check myself. I also really really appreciated this topic because although it is a family concept that I've learned in the past, I haven't thought about it in terms of problem gambling treatment. So I found it really helpful to think of it in that way, with it being that common sense solutions sometimes are important with working with this population.
Right. It's complicated, but it was complicated for me to think it through too. Like, you know, what are and there's lots more we could do on that. Like, how do you know which kind of, you know, level to go for at any given time? It's pretty complex.
Yeah, that was a big, I think, learning curve at the beginning. Not having any problem gambling background.
Right.
That I was trained, to not have any common sense solutions in treatment, but sometimes it is important when working with problem gambling.
We'll have to talk more about that.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, we have one more topic, which I looked up this morning. There was one more request, and all of a sudden I can't remember what it is. So I think we have it tagged already for the last lesson, but is there anything else that people are thinking that they want to add to the list in case there's time, an advanced call or something? Anything else that I should be thinking about? All right, then. Thanks, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you next time. So Greta, this is being videotaped, so I'll send the videotape on to you, and hope to see you all next time. I'm going to end now, I think, if I can figure out how to do it.